In our last video, we took a look at Benjamin Libet's famous neuroscience experiment. In this video, we're going to try to show how you can use that experiment to challenge or argue against the existence of free will. So in this video, we're going to start by reviewing the results that Libet found in his experiment. Then we'll see how you could use those results to develop an argument against the existence of free will. And we'll break this argument into three parts: an empirical premise, an empirical generalization, and a philosophical premise. We'll talk about each of these parts on their own, and then at the end of the video, we'll see how you can put those pieces together to form an overall argument against free will. All right, so when Libet performed his experiment on subjects' voluntary movement of their wrist, he observed the following results. First, there was the readiness potential beginning in their brain. So remember, that's the increase in electrical activity. Second, the subject later became conscious or aware of their decision or urge to flex their wrist. That was measured using the Libet clock and subject's report of where the dot was when they first felt the urge to flex their wrist. Then lastly, the subject flexed their wrist. So here's a diagram just illustrating the timing of events. So the first thing that happens is the EEG measures the increase in electrical activity about 550 milliseconds before they move their wrist, or about half a second. Then a little bit later in the timeline, the thought or the awareness or feeling of the urge, I'll flex my wrist now. So there's the thought bubble there. That occurs about 220 milliseconds before they move their wrist. So about a fifth of a second. And then slightly later, you see the wrist actually flex. So first, there's this unconscious brain activity. Then that leads to a conscious thought, which then slightly later leads to flexing the wrist. So how are these results supposed to challenge the existence of free will, though? Well, we're supposed to worry that our decisions are produced unconsciously by our brains and that we become aware of them only after the fact. And why is that worrisome? Because it seems that deciding freely depends on deciding consciously. If all your decisions are made unconsciously, it seems that it's not up to you what you decide. And that certainly looks like bad news for free will. So that's Mealy on page 3, summarizing the neuroscience challenge. Well, how do we get from Libet's experiment to this challenge? There's a lot of reasoning to spell out here. All right. So the first part of this reasoning against free will involves an empirical premise. What I mean by that, it involves a claim about something we observe. So premise 1 says that the subjects we observe in Libet's experiments do not consciously decide to flex their wrist. So why do Libet and other researchers believe this? Well, according to their interpretation, the beginning of the readiness potential is when a decision to flex is actually being made. Now notice my emphasis, though, on the word interpretation. The readiness potential is a name we give to the increase in electrical activity in the brain slightly before a person makes a voluntary movement, like moving their wrist. But there's a further question of what does that electrical activity actually represent? So this premise goes further by claiming that the electrical activity that happens in the readiness potential it represents a decision being made. So why should we believe, though, that electrical activity is associated with a decision? Well, presumably it's because of a strong correlation we see between the brain activity and the movement. Whenever someone flexes their wrist voluntarily, if we had an EEG machine hooked up to their machine, if we went back about half a second, we would see that electrical activity start to rise every single time before that movement. So thus, we might conclude that the electrical activity is representing a decision being made. Now, after you've gotten this interpretation of what the readiness potential represents, you go on to note that the readiness potential begins before the person reports becoming conscious or aware of the decision or urge to flex. So, they believe that the experiment shows that the person's decision to flex was made unconsciously, since the electrical activity was sort of unconscious, and the person becomes conscious of the decision after the decision has already been made. So now note, this premise only makes a claim about how the subjects in this specific experiment make their decision. From here, the argument makes an empirical generalization. What I mean is that it generalizes what we've observed so far. Premise 2 then says, so people probably never make conscious decisions to do things. Rather, an unconscious decision is made, then they become conscious of the decision after it's been made, and then they do the thing. So why do Libet and others believe this? Well, flexing our wrist is a familiar kind of behavior. We're constantly moving our body, walking from one place to another, sort of using our arm to smack the alarm clock as it sort of rings in the morning, or opening the cupboard to get food behind there. And so the idea is, Libet and others thereby think that the brain activity underlying the decision we make in the experiment is going to be similar. It's going to be representative to how our brain, what's going on in our brain whenever we make a decision. They thereby generalize their finding about how the decisions are made in the experiment, sort of flexing their wrist, to how all our decisions are made even outside the laboratory context. Like when you smack your alarm clock to turn it off, or you walk across the room and open the cupboard to get food behind it. So this implicitly relies on a kind of argument from analogy, or enumerative induction. So on the argument from analogy, the idea is, well, look, these other decisions we make outside of the experiment are similar to the decision to flex our wrist. They're both sort of voluntary movements that we do sort of every day. And since we make the decision to flex our wrist unconsciously, we make the decision outside of this unconsciously as well. Or enumerative induction, you might say, well, in this experiment, look, here's one person. They make their decision to flex unconsciously. Then this other person makes a decision to flex unconsciously. Well, here's another decision that's made unconsciously in the experiment. And then we might do other experiments similar to Libet's. So some people have done ones where they ask people to push a left button or a right button, and they've noticed something similar. The idea is, well, here's another decision that's made unconsciously. And then as we sort of keep on getting these examples, we have sort of we have a number of cases from which we might come to the conclusion that all decisions are made in that same way. From here, the argument needs to connect up these ideas about how decisions are made to claims about free will. And so this here requires a philosophical premise. And premise 3 then says, well, free will requires that our actions result from conscious decisions. So why do Libet and others believe this? Well, this is a purely philosophical premise that makes a claim about the meaning or concept of free will. Libet and others never make clear why they believe that the meaning of free will has this implication. Oftentimes, they never even sort of say what they mean by free will at all. However, let's practice charity here and see what could we say to try to motivate this idea. So let's try to speak on their behalf since they didn't fill out this little detail in their reasoning. Well, free will requires that we have the ability to make rational, informed decisions. That's true on all the definitions we considered: the modest regular grade free will, the ambitious mid-grade free will, and the premium supernatural definition of free will. They all require that you be able to make a rational, informed decision. Now, we naturally most closely associate ourselves with our conscious minds. So it's what I'm aware of or conscious of that seems to be sort of what makes me, me. I mean, yes, there's a lot of stuff going on in my brain sort of unconsciously when I'm sort of sleeping. I mean, I'm sort of unconscious, but that doesn't seem to represent me. And so you might think that it isn't a rational, informed decision if we're not conscious or aware of the decision when it's made. The idea is, if we're not aware of what's going on, then it looks like it's not us that's in control of that decision. And so it's not sort of our conscious selves that's sort of in control of the decision. Now, you might offer additional support by giving an analogy to examples of other cases where we intuitively think that free will is lacking due to the brain sort of causing us to do something unconsciously. So, yet again, think about the person who maybe has an epileptic seizure and that causes their sort of fist to clench, their arm to raise, and to sort of swing across the room and hit a person in the face. Well, we don't think that that person sort of used their free will to hit the person in the face because they weren't in control of this action. Rather, it was something that was just happening sort of unconsciously without their sort of awareness. And so that kind of example might suggest, well, in order for something to be under your control, you need to be aware or conscious of it. So similarly, in order for the decision to be under your control, your rational informed control, you would need to be conscious or aware of that decision. So this is my attempt to fill in for Libet sort of a piece of reasoning that was sort of left absent. Putting all of these pieces together, we can get the Libet argument against free will. It says, subjects in Libet's experiment do not consciously decide to flex their wrist. Rather, they unconsciously decide, then they become conscious of the decision, and then they flex their wrist. So people probably never make conscious decisions to do things, even outside of sort of Libet's experiments. And free will requires that our actions are caused by our conscious decisions to do things, since if we're not conscious or aware of that decision, it seems like we're not in control of the decision, since we think of ourselves as our conscious selves. Therefore, people probably do not have free will. So that's it for this video. Hopefully, I've been able to motivate this reasoning for you so that you can sort of see how someone might be sort of compelled by this line of reasoning and Libet's experiment to deny that we have free will. Hopefully, even if you believe in free will, hopefully you can at least sort of see the other side, and maybe I've instilled a modicum of doubt about the idea that we have free will. In the next video, though, we're going to discuss how someone might try to defend free will by attempting to expose some problems with this style of reasoning that comes from Libet. See you then. Bye-bye.